Picture this Boston Symphony Hall. 2,000 people, sitting in complete silence. A grand piano on stage, polished to perfection under crystal chandeliers. And at that piano, a man in a tattered military coat, his weathered hands dancing across the keys with impossible grace. Tears stream down faces throughout the audience. In the front row, wealthy patrons who arrived in limousines openly weep. And standing just 5 feet from the piano, frozen in place, is Julian Westwood, one of the world's most celebrated pianists, his face wet with tears he cannot control. This is not what anyone expected tonight. Not the audience who paid thousands for their seats. Not the concert staff who tried to stop this moment from happening. And certainly not Julian himself, who 3 hours earlier had orchestrated this entire situation as a cruel joke. The man at the piano is Isaiah Thompson, 55 years old, homeless, a veteran who sleeps in doorways on Tremont Street and searches through trash bins for his next meal. Right now, he's playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with such profound beauty that grown men and women cannot hold back their emotions. But how did we get here? How did a homeless man end up on this stage, reducing an audience of Boston's elite to tears? And what happened to Julian Westwood, the arrogant virtuoso who started this evening with nothing but contempt in his heart? To understand this moment, we need to go back. Back 3 hours. Back 38 years. Back to a story of dreams and war loss and redemption. A story that proves talent never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to break through. Let's start at the beginning. Or rather, let's start 72 hours before this impossible moment. Julian Westwood. If you follow classical music, you know the name. Child prodigy turned international sensation. 42 years old, with a career most musicians only dream about. Carnegie Hall debuts, sold-out tours across Europe, recording contracts with major labels, critical acclaim that borders on worship. The New York Times once called him the most technically perfect pianist of his generation. The Guardian praised his flawless interpretation of the masters. 3 Grammy nominations, 5 platinum classical albums, a brownstone in Manhattan's Upper West Side worth $8 million. But if you ask anyone who's worked with Julian, you'll hear a different story. Behind the polished image and impeccable performances, there's an ego that fills every room he enters, a condescension toward anyone he considers beneath him, a cruelty masked as wit. His manager quit last year after he berated her in front of an entire concert hall staff because a piano bench was 3 inches too low. Orchestra members dread working with him. Interviews are carefully scripted because Julian has a habit of insulting journalists who ask questions he finds pedestrian. 3 days before our story begins, Julian's publicist came to him with an idea. A charity concert in Boston. Benefits for homeless veterans. Great PR. Great optics. The perfect way to soften his image while maintaining his artistic prestige. Julian agreed immediately. Not because he cared about veterans, not because he wanted to help the homeless, but because he understood the value of appearing to care. The headlines would be perfect. Classical music icon gives back. Westwood's generous spirit. The kind of coverage that translates to ticket sales and booking fees. He scheduled it for Saturday night at Boston Symphony Hall. Ticket prices ranged from $500 to $5,000 per seat. The proceeds after expenses and his standard fee would go to various veterans' charities. Julian made sure the press knew about his generous donation of time and talent. But generosity had nothing to do with it. This was business. This was brand management. And Julian approached it the same way he approached everything, with meticulous planning and absolute confidence in his superiority. He arrived in Boston 3 days early. stayed at the Four Seasons, rehearsed daily at Symphony Hall, making the staff adjust lighting and acoustics until everything met his impossible standards. He approved the program Chopin Liszt Beethoven. Pieces that would showcase his technical mastery while appearing accessible to the wealthy donors in the audience. And he planned something special for the end. An audience participation segment, a gimmick his publicist suggested. Invite someone from the crowd to sit at the piano. Let them try. Show this contrast between amateur and professional. Make the audience appreciate his genius even more. Julian loved the idea, the opportunity to demonstrate the vast gulf between himself and ordinary people. The chance to be magnanimous while simultaneously proving his superiority. Perfect. He had no idea that this decision would lead to the most humbling moment of his entire life. While Julian Westwood prepared for his concert in a luxury hotel suite, Isaiah Thompson woke up in a doorway on Tremont Street, his body stiff from another night on cold concrete. 55 years old, but he looked 70. His face weathered by decades of sun and wind and hardship. His hands scarred and calloused. His military coat, the only possession from his past life that he still owned, was torn and stained, but still bore the faded insignia of the United States Army. Isaiah had been homeless for 11 years. Before that, he'd struggled through 7 years of barely surviving in shelters and cheap motels, working odd jobs that never lasted fighting demons no one else could see. 18 years total since his life fell apart. 18 years since he'd lost everything that mattered. His daily routine was simple. Wake up. Find somewhere to wash his face, usually a gas station bathroom. Look for food mostly from dumpsters behind restaurants, or the occasional handout from kind strangers. Find a spot where he could sit without being moved along by police. Survive another day. Repeat. Boston in November was brutal for street living. The cold cut through his coat. The wind off the harbor felt like knives. Most nights, Isaiah found steam vents or subway stations where he could escape the worst of it. During the day, he walked. Miles and miles through the city because movement meant warmth, and stopping meant freezing. People passed him on the sidewalk without seeing him. That was the strange thing about being homeless. You became invisible. Businessmen in $1,000 suits stepped around him like he was furniture. Tourists clutched their bags tighter and walked faster. Parents pulled their children to the other side of the street. Isaiah understood. He probably would have done the same back when he had a life. Back when he was someone different. 3 days before the concert, on a Wednesday afternoon, Isaiah sat outside a cafe on Newbury Street. He wasn't panhandling, just sitting watching the world move past him. That's when he met Mrs. Elena Rodriguez. She was 72, a retired teacher with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She'd noticed Isaiah there for the past week, always quiet, never aggressive or demanding like some of the other homeless people in the area. There was something different about him, a dignity despite the circumstances, a sadness in his eyes that spoke of loss rather than vice. Mrs. Rodriguez approached him with a paper bag. "I bought too much lunch," she said, which they both knew was a lie. Inside was a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. Isaiah's voice cracked when he thanked her. It had been 3 days since anyone had spoken to him with genuine kindness. They talked. Not long, maybe 15 minutes. Mrs. Rodriguez asked his name, where he was from. Isaiah told her small truths carefully edited. Yes, he was a veteran. Yes, he'd fallen on hard times. No, he didn't have family. The deeper truths. The painful truths he kept to himself. As she stood to leave, Mrs. Rodriguez reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "My husband passed away 6 months ago," she said. "He loved classical music. We had season tickets to Symphony Hall. I can't bring myself to go anymore, but I can't throw the tickets away either." She handed Isaiah the envelope. "There's a concert Saturday night, a benefit for veterans. I think Miguel would have wanted someone to use his seat. Would you go? For him?" Isaiah stared at the ticket. Boston Symphony Hall. Saturday, 8 p.m. Orchestra section row M seat 12. The ticket probably cost $500. "I can't," he said. "I don't belong in a place like that." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled sadly. "My husband used to say music belongs to everyone. It doesn't care about your clothes or your address. Please, it would mean something to me." She pressed the envelope into his hands and walked away before he could refuse again. That night, sitting in his doorway, Isaiah looked at the ticket for a long time. How many years had it been since he'd heard live music? How many years since he'd been inside a concert hall? The memories were painful, so he usually kept them locked away. But something about Mrs. Rodriguez's kindness had cracked something open inside him. For the first time in years, Isaiah let himself remember what it felt like to sit at a piano, to let music flow through his fingers, to feel just for a moment like he was something more than a broken man on a street corner. He decided he would go. He would wash his coat as best he could. He would clean himself up at the shelter. He would sit in the back of that concert hall and let himself remember just for one night what it felt like to be human. Isaiah Thompson had no idea that this decision would change everything. To understand what happened on that concert stage, you need to know where Isaiah's journey began. You need to go back 49 years to a small church in Detroit, where a 6-year-old boy first touched piano keys and discovered magic. Isaiah Thompson was born in 1970 to a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. They lived in a cramped apartment in one of Detroit's poorest neighborhoods. His mother, Grace Thompson, was a cleaning woman who worked nights at office buildings and days at a hospital. She loved her son fiercely, but she was rarely home. Isaiah spent most of his childhood alone, or at the neighborhood church, where Reverend Marcus Williams ran an after-school program for kids who had nowhere else to go. The church was small and shabby, but it had one treasure, an old upright piano that had been donated decades earlier. Most kids ignored the piano, but Isaiah, 6 years old and impossibly shy, was drawn to it like gravity. He would stand next to it, running his small fingers over the keys without pressing down, afraid he would get in trouble for making noise. Reverend Williams noticed. One Tuesday afternoon, when the other kids were playing basketball outside, he found Isaiah standing by the piano, as usual. "You want to try it?" the Reverend asked. Isaiah nodded, too nervous to speak. "Go ahead. Play whatever you want." Isaiah sat on the bench, his feet barely reaching the floor. He pressed one key, then another. Random notes, no pattern, just exploring the sounds. And then something extraordinary happened. His fingers found a melody. Not from any song he'd heard, just something that existed in his mind flowing out through his hands. Simple, childish, but undeniably musical. Notes that fit together in a way that made sense. Reverend Williams felt goosebumps rise on his arms. He'd seen a lot of kids try that piano over the years. Most banged on it randomly. Some could pick out "Mary Had a Little Lamb" if they'd been taught. But this was different. This was instinct. This was gift. "Do you know what you just played?" he asked. Isaiah shook his head. "That was music, son. real music, from inside you. From that day forward, Isaiah spent every afternoon at that piano. Reverend Williams taught him what he could, the basics of reading music scales, simple songs. But Isaiah learned faster than he could teach. Within months, the 6-year-old was playing hymns by ear. Within a year, he was composing his own pieces. The Reverend saw something he'd only heard about in stories. Natural talent so profound, it seemed supernatural. Perfect pitch. Hands that understood the keyboard like they'd been designed for it. An emotional connection to music that most trained musicians spend decades trying to develop. He started bringing sheet music from the library. Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin. Music that should have been far beyond a 7-year-old's ability. Isaiah stumbled through it at first, but he persevered. Hours every day on that old piano, his small hands stretching to reach chords, his mind absorbing musical language like a sponge. By age 10, Isaiah could play pieces that advanced students struggled with. By 12, he was performing at church services, his playing so beautiful that grown members of the congregation wept. By 14, he'd exhausted every piece of sheet music Reverend Williams could find. But there was a problem. Isaiah's mother couldn't afford lessons with a real teacher. She couldn't buy a piano for their apartment. The church piano was falling apart, several keys sticking, the sound becoming tinny and unreliable. Reverend Williams knew that Isaiah's gift would be wasted if he didn't get proper training. So he did something extraordinary. He started making calls to music schools, to teachers, to anyone who might help. He recorded Isaiah playing and sent tapes to conservatories. Most ignored him. A few sent polite rejections, but one letter changed everything. The Juilliard School in New York City had a program for exceptional students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Full scholarships, room and board included for the most talented young musicians in America. Applications were brutally competitive. Hundreds of applicants for maybe 5 spots per year. Reverend Williams helped Isaiah prepare an application. They recorded him playing 3 pieces, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, major Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and one of Isaiah's own compositions. They sent it off with a prayer. 3 months later, a letter arrived. Isaiah Thompson, 17 years old, from Detroit, Michigan, had been accepted to the Juilliard School with a full scholarship. His mother cried for an hour when she heard. Reverend Williams hugged him so hard, Isaiah thought his ribs might crack. This was it. This was the escape from poverty. This was the chance to turn his gift into a life. In August of 1987, Isaiah Thompson boarded a bus to New York City with 1 suitcase and a heart full of dreams. He was going to become a concert pianist. He was going to make his mother proud. He was going to prove that talent and hard work could overcome any obstacle. He had no idea that the universe had different plans. Juilliard was overwhelming at first. Isaiah had never been outside Michigan. Suddenly he was in Manhattan, surrounded by students who'd had private lessons since age 4, who owned expensive instruments, who spoke casually about summer programs in Vienna and Paris. He felt like an imposter. His clothes were second-hand. His technique, while instinctive and powerful, lacked the polish of formal training. He didn't know the unspoken social codes of classical music culture. Other students came from wealth, from families with connections in the music world. Isaiah came from a Detroit housing project with a mother who cleaned toilets for a living. But when he sat at a piano, none of that mattered. His professors recognized immediately what Reverend Williams had seen years before. Isaiah Thompson wasn't just talented. He was exceptional. His technical ability, while rough in places, could be refined. But his musicality, his ability to make a piano sing with genuine emotion that couldn't be taught. That was pure gift. Professor Catherine Hartwell, a renowned concert pianist who taught advanced performance, took special interest in Isaiah. She worked with him privately, refining his technique, teaching him the nuances of interpretation, pushing him to reach beyond what he thought possible. "You have something rare," she told him during his first year. "Most students here are technically proficient. They can play the notes perfectly. But you make people feel. Never lose that. Technique can be learned. Soul cannot." Isaiah threw himself into his studies with obsessive dedication, while other students socialized or explored the city he practiced. 8 hours a day, minimum. Scales, arpeggios, etudes. Then the repertoire, Bach, Brahms, Rachmaninoff, Prokofiev. Pieces that pushed his abilities to the limit. By his second year, he was outperforming students who'd been training their entire lives. Professors began mentioning his name in conversations about the school's most promising talents. There was talk of competitions of potential debuts of a career that could be truly extraordinary. And then, in the spring of his second year, Isaiah met Sarah Mitchell. She wasn't a music student. Sarah was studying medicine at Columbia University, but she loved classical music and would sometimes sneak into Juilliard practice rooms just to listen. One Tuesday evening, she heard someone playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in a practice room and stopped in the hallway, transfixed. When Isaiah finished, she knocked on the door. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Isaiah looked up at this stranger with warm brown eyes and an easy smile, and something in his chest shifted. They talked for 3 hours that night. About music, about life, about dreams. Sarah told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about wanting to be a doctor, about her love of piano music even though she'd never learned to play. Isaiah told her about Detroit, about Reverend Williams, about the miracle of being at Juilliard. He didn't usually open up to people, but Sarah made it easy. She listened like his words mattered. She asked questions that showed genuine interest. She laughed at his awkward jokes. They started meeting regularly. Coffee before her classes, late dinners after his practice sessions, long walks through Central Park where Isaiah would tell her about the pieces he was learning, and Sarah would tell him about her anatomy classes and the patients she was starting to see in her clinical rotations. They fell in love slowly, then all at once. By the end of that semester, they were inseparable. Sarah would come to Isaiah's recitals and beam with pride from the audience. Isaiah would help Sarah study quizzing her on medical terminology while they shared cheap takeout in his dorm room. For the first time in his life, Isaiah had something beyond music. He had someone who loved him not for his talent, but for who he was. Someone who saw past the gift to the person underneath. In his third year, Isaiah started winning competitions. Regional at first, then national. His name began appearing in classical music publications. Agents started attending his performances. Professor Hartwell told him he had a real shot at a major concert career if he kept progressing. Everything was falling into place. The dream he'd carried since childhood was becoming reality. And he had Sarah beside him supporting him, believing in him. They got engaged in the spring of his fourth year. Nothing fancy, just Isaiah on one knee in Riverside Park with a simple ring that cost him 3 months of his work-study salary. Sarah said yes before he even finished asking. They planned to marry after graduation. Isaiah would pursue his concert career. Sarah would finish medical school. They'd build a life together in New York, 2 kids from working-class families who'd made it through talent and determination. But there was a problem that Isaiah tried not to think about. Money. Even with his scholarship, living in New York was expensive. Sarah had student loans that would take decades to repay. A concert career, even a successful one, took years to become financially stable. Competition winners didn't automatically translate to sold-out performances and recording contracts. Isaiah's mother was getting older, still working those same 2 jobs in Detroit. He wanted to help her to give her an easier life. Sarah's parents had sacrificed to put her through college before medical school. They wanted to help their parents to build security to start a family of their own someday. The mathematics were harsh. Isaiah could spend another 5 to 10 years building a concert career, scrambling for gigs, teaching on the side to make ends meet, hoping for a breakthrough. Or he could find a way to make real money, now secure their future, and return to music later when they were stable. One afternoon, Isaiah saw a recruitment poster at the student center. The Army had a program for college graduates. Sign up for 4 years, get a signing bonus, receive steady pay and benefits. After 4 years, come home with savings and GI Bill benefits for further education. 4 years. That was all. Serve his country, make some money, secure his and Sarah's future. Then come back to music with financial stability. Maybe even attend graduate programs. Plenty of musicians had taken breaks and returned successfully. Isaiah didn't tell Sarah he was considering it at first. He didn't tell Professor Hartwell, who was planning his debut at a major venue. He just went to the recruitment office and asked questions. The recruiter painted a compelling picture. Leadership opportunities. Respect. Service. Financial security. And when Isaiah mentioned his piano skills, the recruiter's eyes lit up. We have bands, music programs. Someone with your talent could have opportunities to play even while serving. It seemed perfect. Too perfect. But Isaiah was 21 years old in love, desperate to build a stable future. He let himself believe it. He enlisted 2 weeks before graduation from Juilliard, signed a 4-year contract with the United States Army, collected his signing bonus, and put it in a savings account for their future. When he told Sarah, she cried. Not from happiness, from fear. "You're throwing away everything you've worked for?" she said. "Music is who you are." "I'll come back to it," Isaiah promised. 4 years. We'll save money, start our life, and then I'll have the stability to really pursue music the right way. Sarah wanted to believe him. She tried to be supportive. They got married 3 weeks after his graduation, a small ceremony with their families present. Then Isaiah reported for basic training. Professor Hartwell didn't attend the wedding. When Isaiah told her his plans, she looked at him with profound sadness. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You have a gift that appears once in a generation. If you walk away now, you may never get it back." "I'll only be gone 4 years," Isaiah said. Professor Hartwell shook her head. 4 years is a lifetime in this world, and war changes people. Please reconsider." But Isaiah had made his choice. He believed he could have both: service and music, security and artistry. He believed that talent would wait. He was wrong. Basic training was harder than Isaiah imagined. The physical demands were brutal for someone who'd spent his life at a piano bench instead of a gym. But he pushed through. 8 weeks of running obstacle courses, weapons training, discipline. The Army didn't put him in a band unit like the recruiter had suggested. They sent him to infantry training. Then in 2003, as tensions in the Middle East escalated, Isaiah's unit received deployment orders. Iraq. Sarah was pregnant when he left. Their daughter Emma was born while Isaiah was in Baghdad, and he only saw her face through grainy video calls. Sarah would hold the baby up to the camera, and Isaiah would cry in his barracks, desperate to hold his daughter, to be there for his wife. Iraq was hell. Not the sanitized version you see in movies. Real hell. Heat that felt like breathing fire. Sand that got into everything. The constant threat of IEDs, ambushes, suicide bombers. Friends dying next to you. Children caught in crossfire. The smell of death that never left your nostrils. Isaiah tried to hold on to music in his mind. Between patrols, he would close his eyes and mentally play pieces, his fingers moving on invisible keys. It was the only thing that kept him sane. Rachmaninoff in a war zone. Chopin while his unit searched buildings for insurgents. But music was fading. The part of his brain that held melodies and harmonies was being overwhelmed by trauma. Explosions, screams, the faces of dead civilians, the weight of his rifle. The terror of every corner turned, every door kicked open, every moment wondering if the next second would be your last. He wrote letters to Sarah constantly. She wrote back, sending photos of Emma. "She has your eyes," Sarah wrote. "She smiles when I play music. I think she's going to be musical like her daddy." Those letters were everything. They were the future Isaiah was fighting for. Get through this deployment. Go home. Hold his daughter. Play music for her. Build the life he'd promised Sarah. He'd been in Iraq for 18 months when he got a 2-week leave. Finally going home. He'd see Sarah and Emma in person. He'd get to hold his daughter, who was now almost 2 years old. 2 weeks of normal life before returning to finish his deployment. Isaiah landed at Fort Hood in Texas on November 12, 2006. He was supposed to catch a connecting flight to Detroit the next morning to see his family. He went to the barracks that night, set his alarm, and fell asleep dreaming of Sarah's smile and Emma's laugh. The army chaplain woke him at 3 in the morning. The moment Isaiah saw the chaplain's face, he knew. Soldiers know that look. It's the look that comes before the words that destroy your world. "Private Thompson, I need you to sit down." Sarah and Emma had been driving to the airport to meet him. A drunk driver ran a red light at 70 miles per hour. Killed them both instantly. Sarah was 31 years old. Emma was 22 months old. Isaiah didn't remember screaming. Didn't remember the chaplain trying to calm him down. Didn't remember the next 3 days at all. His mind simply shut off, unable to process a grief so enormous it had no name. The army gave him emergency leave for the funerals. He flew to Detroit in a daze. Saw his mother, who'd aged a decade in grief. Saw Sarah's parents broken beyond repair. Stood at 2 caskets, one big and one impossibly small, and felt his soul crack into pieces. He didn't cry at the funeral. Couldn't. He just stood there hollow while Reverend Williams gave the eulogy, while his mother sobbed into his shoulder, while Sarah's mother collapsed at the graveside. After the funeral, Isaiah went back to his mother's apartment, saw Emma's toys that Sarah had brought on her last visit, saw photos of his wife and daughter, saw the future that had been stolen. And something inside Isaiah Thompson died that day. Not his body. His body kept functioning, kept breathing, kept going through motions. But the essential thing that made him who he was, that spark that connected him to music and joy and hope, that died and was buried in a Detroit cemetery alongside his wife and daughter. The army sent him back to Iraq 3 weeks later. He still had 9 months on his deployment. 9 months of functioning while dead inside. He stopped writing letters because there was no one to write to. He stopped thinking about the future because there was no future. He just existed day to day, waiting for a bullet or a bomb to finish what grief had started. He became reckless, volunteered for dangerous missions, walked point on patrols, part of him hoping that the next IED would take him to let him stop feeling this pain. But the explosions always missed him. His friends died. He survived. By the time his deployment ended and he returned to the United States in 2007, Isaiah Thompson was a shell. The nightmares came every night. Iraq and Detroit mixed together in his dreams. Explosions and car crashes. Emma's laugh and the screams of wounded soldiers. They call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. For Isaiah, it was more than that. It was the complete destruction of his ability to function in normal society. Loud noises sent him diving for cover. Crowds made him panic. Sleep was impossible without medication, and the medication turned him into a zombie. The Army discharged him with full benefits and a disability rating, gave him a phone number for the VA, told him good luck. Isaiah tried to go back to music. Went to the piano at his mother's church, the same piano where this all started. Sat down, put his hands on the keys. Nothing. The connection was gone. His fingers felt like wood. The music that used to flow effortlessly was trapped behind a wall of trauma and grief. He could still play the notes mechanically, but there was no soul, no feeling. Just empty technical exercise. It was like losing Sarah and Emma all over again. Music had been his identity, his purpose, his gift. Now even that was gone. Isaiah spiraled, started drinking to numb the pain, lost touch with friends from Juilliard, couldn't hold down jobs because the PTSD made him unpredictable, went through his savings, ended up in his mother's apartment, a ghost haunting her living room. His mother tried to help, but she didn't understand. How could she? How could anyone understand what it felt like to lose everything? Wife, daughter, career, identity, all gone. When his mother died of a heart attack in 2012, Isaiah had nothing left. No family, no purpose, no reason to keep fighting. He ended up on the streets. First in Detroit, then drifting east, eventually ending up in Boston. Homeless, broken, waiting to die. For 11 years, Isaiah Thompson lived on sidewalks and in doorways. He stopped thinking of himself as a pianist, as a veteran, as anything, except a man waiting for his story to end. Until a kind woman named Elena Rodriguez gave him a concert ticket and asked him to use it in memory of her husband. Until arrogance and cruelty pushed him to make a choice that would change everything. Saturday evening, Boston Symphony Hall glowed against the November darkness. Limousines pulled up to the entrance. Women in evening gowns and men in tuxedos stepped onto red carpets. This was high society at its finest. $500 tickets, champagne in the lobby, conversations about vacation homes and stock portfolios. Isaiah Thompson approached the entrance in his tattered army coat, his hands shaking slightly. Not from cold, from the sheer wrongness of being here. He didn't belong in this world anymore. Security at the door looked at him with immediate suspicion. A homeless man approaching Symphony Hall. This happened sometimes. Confused individuals looking for shelter or handouts. "Sir, you can't be here," the security guard said, already reaching for his radio. Isaiah held up the ticket with trembling hands. The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. He examined the ticket. "Real. Orchestra section. Premium seat. Where did you get this? A friend gave it to me," Isaiah said quietly. Which was true. Mrs. Rodriguez had become a friend in their brief encounter. The guard looked him up and down. The coat, the worn shoes, the weathered face. This man clearly didn't fit the demographic, but the ticket was legitimate. Fine. But any trouble, and you're out. Understood? Isaiah nodded and walked through the ornate doors into a world he'd left behind 18 years ago. The lobby was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, the scent of expensive perfume. People glanced at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. He heard whispers, saw pointing, felt judgment radiating from every direction. He found his seat in the orchestra section, row M, seat 12, right in the middle. On either side of him, wealthy patrons shifted uncomfortably. The woman to his left actually changed seats, moving to an empty one several rows back. Isaiah wanted to disappear. This was a mistake. He should leave, but something kept him in that seat. Maybe stubbornness, maybe the memory of Mrs. Rodriguez's kindness, maybe just exhaustion from running for so many years. The lights dimmed, the audience settled, and Julian Westwood walked onto the stage. The applause was thunderous. Julian smiled, bowed, sat at the Steinway grand piano. Even from a distance, Isaiah could see the instrument's beauty. 9 feet of polished perfection. The kind of piano he'd once dreamed of owning. Julian began playing. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Technically perfect. Every note crystal clear. Every dynamic precisely controlled. It was impressive, but it was empty. Isaiah could hear it immediately. The notes were perfect, but there was no soul. Julian was playing for the audience, not for the music. Performing rather than connecting. It was virtuosity without vulnerability. Skill without substance. The audience didn't notice. They applauded enthusiastically after each piece. Julian played Liszt, then Beethoven. All flawless, all emotionally hollow. During the intermission, Julian stood at the piano and addressed the audience. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your generous donations will help veterans in need. It's an honor to contribute to such an important cause." The words were right, but the tone was wrong. Isaiah had heard enough fake concern in his life to recognize it instantly. Julian didn't care about veterans. This was theater. For my final piece tonight, Julian continued. "I want to do something special. Music at its core is about connection and sharing, so I'd like to invite someone from the audience to join me on stage. A chance to try this magnificent instrument. Anyone, don't be shy." Hands immediately shot up, wealthy patrons excited for their moment. Julian scanned the crowd, clearly looking for someone specific, someone who would make him look good by comparison. Then his eyes landed on Isaiah. The homeless veteran in the army coat, sitting in the middle of orchestra section, clearly not belonging. "Perfect. You, sir," Julian said, pointing directly at Isaiah. "The gentleman in the military coat. Would you join me on stage?" Every head in the audience turned. 2,000 people staring at Isaiah. Whispers erupted immediately. "Is that a homeless man? How did he get in here? This is absurd." Isaiah froze. This was Julian's game. Invite the homeless veteran, make him fumble at the piano, show the vast difference between trained genius and unfortunate poverty. Get points for being inclusive while actually being cruel. "Come on," Julian insisted, his smile sharp. "Don't be modest. I insist." Isaiah shook his head. "No, thank you." "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian addressed the crowd. "I think our friend is shy. Should we encourage him?" A few people clapped politely. Others remained silent, uncomfortable with whatever was unfolding. Julian walked down from the stage into the audience, directly toward Isaiah. His smile never wavered, but his eyes were calculating. "I really must insist," Julian said loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. "You've paid for a ticket. You're clearly interested in music, and this is for charity after all, for veterans. Surely you support our veterans. It was a trap. Refuse and look ungrateful. Accept and be humiliated. Isaiah felt rage building in his chest. Not the uncontrolled rage of PTSD, but something colder, clearer. This privileged man playing games with people's dignity, using charity as a shield for cruelty. In that moment, 18 years of pain and anger and grief crystallized into a single thought: no more. No more being invisible. No more accepting humiliation. No more letting arrogant men in expensive suits treat him like he was nothing. Isaiah stood up. The audience gasped. Some in anticipation of the spectacle, others in genuine concern. "I'll come to your stage," Isaiah said quietly. "But you should know something first." "What's that?" Julian asked, still smiling. "You're about to regret this." Julian's smile faltered for just a second, then recovered. "We'll see about that. Come on up." Isaiah walked down the aisle toward the stage. Every step was agony. His heart pounded. His hands trembled. The audience watched in silence, some excited, some horrified. He climbed the steps to the stage, walked across that polished floor in his worn shoes, approached the Steinway grand piano like a man walking toward his own execution. Julian gestured magnanimously. "All yours. Play whatever you'd like. Nothing too complicated, of course. Maybe chopsticks." The audience laughed. Polite, uncomfortable laughter. Isaiah sat on the bench, looked at the keys. 88 pieces of ivory and ebony that once upon a time had been his whole world. He hadn't played in front of people in 18 years, hadn't really played at all in 11. The last time he'd touched a piano, it was at his mother's church, trying desperately to find something that grief had stolen. But sitting here now, in front of Julian's smugness and the audience's expectation, and his own broken history, Isaiah felt something shift inside him. Rage, grief, determination, love, memory. All of it focused into a single moment. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and let his hands find the keys. Isaiah's fingers rested on the keys, trembling slightly. He could hear Julian behind him, probably preparing some witty comment for when the homeless veteran fumbled through, "Mary had a little lamb," or gave up entirely. He could hear the audience shifting in their seats, some leaning forward in curiosity, others already looking at their programs, ready to move past this awkward moment. For 18 years, Isaiah had run from music, from pianos, from the memories they carried, because sitting at a piano meant remembering who he used to be, who he'd lost, everything that grief had stolen. But sitting here now, with Julian Westwood's arrogance radiating behind him and 2,000 people waiting to watch him fail, Isaiah realized something. Running hadn't worked. Hiding hadn't worked. Pretending music had never been part of him hadn't worked. The grief was still there. The loss, the trauma, all of it carried in his bones every single day for 18 years. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running from it, to face it, to let it out through the only language he'd ever really understood. In his mind, Isaiah heard Reverend Williams' voice from decades ago. "Music isn't about the notes, son. It's about what you feel. Play with your soul and people will listen." He heard Professor Hartwell at Juilliard. "You make people feel." Never lose that. Technique can be learned. Soul cannot. He heard Sarah sitting next to him in Central Park on a spring afternoon. "When you play, I can hear your heart. It's the most beautiful thing in the world." And he heard Emma. Not in memory, because she'd never lived long enough to speak in full sentences, but in imagination. What she might have said if she'd grown up. "Play for me, Daddy." Isaiah opened his eyes, looked at the piano keys, made a choice. He wouldn't play for Julian Westwood, wouldn't play to prove anything to the wealthy people in this audience who'd already judged him, wouldn't play for revenge or vindication. He would play for Sarah, for Emma, for the 18 years of silence and grief, for the man he used to be and the man he might still become. He would play for Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd shown him kindness when he'd forgotten what kindness felt like. He would play for every homeless veteran sleeping in doorways tonight, invisible to the world. He would play for the 6-year-old boy in Detroit who'd touched piano keys for the first time and discovered magic. Isaiah's hands settled into position. His fingers curved over the keys. Muscle memory from thousands of hours of practice, buried but not forgotten, came flooding back. He chose the piece without conscious thought. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece he'd been learning at Juilliard when he met Sarah. The piece he'd played in competitions before the army. The piece that held every memory of love and hope and dreams. Sarah's favorite piece. Behind him, Julian shifted impatiently. "Whenever you're ready," he said with barely concealed condescension. Isaiah didn't respond. He simply closed his eyes one more time and began to play. The first notes emerged from the Steinway like a whisper. Soft, hesitant, almost fragile. This was how Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 began. Not with bombast or drama, but with 8 simple chords in the low register. Patient, building, full of promise. Isaiah's hands knew these chords, had played them hundreds of times, but never like this. Never with 18 years of silence weighing on every note. Never with this much pain flowing through his fingers. The audience didn't understand yet. Some were still whispering to each other, expecting this to fall apart any second. Julian stood behind the piano with arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable moment when this homeless veteran would lose his place. Fumble the notes proved Julian's assumption that real artistry belonged to people like him. But something was happening that no one expected. The chords continued. Steady, growing slightly in volume. Isaiah's technique was rusty. Yes, 18 years away from serious practice had taken their toll. Some of the precision was gone, some of the speed. But the soul was there, raw and bleeding and absolutely real. The whispers in the audience began to fade. People started actually listening, because there was something in these notes that didn't match the man at the piano. Something that suggested this wasn't going to be the spectacle Julian had planned. The opening chords resolved into the first melodic phrase. Simple, beautiful, achingly sad. Isaiah's right hand carried the melody while his left maintained the harmonic foundation. This was basic piano technique, but it was executed with such profound emotion that it transcended technique entirely. Julian's smirk began to fade. He'd expected fumbling. Wrong notes, embarrassment. This wasn't that. This was actual playing, real music. The melody developed climbing higher on the keyboard. Isaiah's hands stretched to reach the chords, his fingers remembering patterns they hadn't touched in nearly 2 decades. Some of the transitions were rough. His timing wavered slightly in places, but none of that mattered because the emotional truth of the music was undeniable. In the audience, people stopped checking their phones, stopped looking at programs, actually watched. The woman who'd moved seats to avoid sitting next to Isaiah was leaning forward now, her expression shifting from disgust to confusion to something approaching wonder. The piece moved into its second major theme, more flowing now, the melody rising and falling like waves. This was the section where Sarah used to close her eyes and smile, letting the music wash over her. Isaiah saw her in his mind, not as she was at the end, broken in a car crash, but alive, smiling, her hand in his as they walked through Central Park, her voice saying, "I love you," before he deployed, her face in video calls holding baby Emma up to the camera. His eyes remained closed, but tears began sliding down his cheeks. The music carried all of it, love and loss and the unbearable weight of grief. Every note was a memory. Every phrase was goodbye and hello, and I'm sorry, and I miss you. The audience was completely silent now. Even the skeptics. Even the ones who'd been waiting for this to fail. Because what was happening on that stage was undeniable. This wasn't a homeless man fumbling through a piece he'd once known. This was a musician coming back to life. Broken, yes. Rusty, yes. But real in a way that Julian's technically perfect performance had never been. Julian stood frozen, his arms slowly uncrossing. The expression on his face shifting from smug anticipation to genuine shock. This wasn't possible. Homeless veterans didn't play like this. People in tattered coats didn't have this kind of training, this level of ability. Who was this man? The music was building now, moving toward the piece's first major crescendo. Isaiah's hands moved faster, the notes accumulating, the emotion intensifying. His whole body swayed slightly, with the music lost in it, transported. For the first time in 18 years, Isaiah Thompson wasn't in Boston. He wasn't on a stage. He wasn't a homeless veteran. He was music. Pure and simple. The thing he'd always been before war and grief broke him. And in that moment, the 2,000 people in Boston Symphony Hall began to understand that they weren't watching a charity stunt or an awkward spectacle. They were witnessing a resurrection. Isaiah's hands moved across the keyboard with increasing confidence. The rust was falling away, note by note. Muscle memory buried for 18 years was reasserting itself. His fingers remembered the patterns, the stretches, the complex chord voicings that made Rachmaninoff so technically demanding. This was one of the most difficult piano concertos in the classical repertoire. Musicians spent years mastering it. The physical demands alone were enormous. Huge chord stretches, rapid octave passages, sections that required absolute precision at high speed. Isaiah was playing it from memory. Imperfectly, yes. Some notes were missed. Some passages were slower than they should be. But he was playing it. All of it. Without sheet music. Without preparation. Drawing on training from 20 years ago. The audience was leaning forward now. All of them. The whispers had stopped completely. Even the people who knew nothing about classical music could tell something extraordinary was happening. Julian Westwood remained motionless behind the piano, his face pale. He knew this concerto intimately, had performed it dozens of times. He recognized immediately what level of training it took to play it at all, let alone play it with this kind of emotional depth. His mind was racing. Who was this man? Where had he trained? How was this possible? The music moved through its development section. Faster now, more technically complex. Isaiah's hands flew across the keys, executing passages that required years of dedicated practice. His left hand carried dense harmonic progressions, while his right sang out the melodic lines. In one particularly difficult section, his pinky finger slipped on a chord. A small mistake. But instead of falling apart, Isaiah incorporated it, adjusted on the fly, kept going. The mark of a trained musician, the ability to recover from errors without losing the musical flow. Professor Hartwell had drilled that into him at Juilliard. Everyone makes mistakes in performance. Professionals keep playing. Amateurs stop. The piece climbed toward its first major climax. Massive chords in both hands, the kind of passages that make pianos thunder. Isaiah leaned into it, his whole body behind each note. The Steinway responded, its tone rich and powerful, filling the entire hall. Audience members sat with mouths slightly open. This wasn't supposed to happen. The homeless man was supposed to play poorly. Julian was supposed to be gracious about it. Everyone was supposed to applaud politely and move on. But this was a real performance, flawed but powerful, imperfect but profoundly moving. A woman in the third row began to cry. She didn't know why exactly. The music was just so sad and beautiful and honest. It reached into her chest and pulled something loose. An older man in the balcony recognized the piece. He'd heard it performed by famous concert pianists. This version wasn't as polished as those professional recordings, but it had something they often lacked: authenticity, real emotional weight. Julian's hands were trembling slightly. He was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years: genuine respect for another musician, maybe even inadequacy. This homeless veteran was doing something Julian, for all his technical perfection, had never achieved. Playing music that mattered. Music that changed people. The climax resolved into a quieter section. Isaiah's playing softened. The tears were flowing freely down his face now, but his hands never stopped. The music was a river, and he was caught in its current, unable to stop, even if he wanted to. In his mind, memories flickered like a film. Sarah, lying in bed, her hand on her pregnant belly. Emma's first smile. His mother, proud beyond words when he got accepted to Juilliard. Reverend Williams saying, "You have a gift, son." Then the darker memories. Explosions in Iraq. The chaplain's face at 3 a.m. 2 caskets. His mother's apartment after she died. The first night sleeping on the street. All of it poured into the music. 18 years of pain and loss. But also 18 years of endurance, of survival, of refusing to completely give up even when giving up seemed easier. The piece moved into its second major theme. More lyrical now. Romantic. This was the section that had made Sarah cry the first time she heard it. "It sounds like falling in love," she'd said. Isaiah played it for her. Every note a conversation with the dead. "I miss you. I'm sorry. I love you still. Always." The audience was completely transfixed now. No coughing, no shifting in seats. Absolute silence, except for the piano. People were crying throughout the hall. Not everyone, but enough. The music was connecting with something deep, something universal. Loss and love and the terrible beauty of grief. Julian wiped his eyes quickly, trying to maintain composure. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a performance. It was confession. Exorcism. A man using music to process trauma too enormous for words. The technique was secondary to the truth, and the truth was devastating. The music shifted again. Faster tempo now, more aggressive. This was the section where Rachmaninoff unleashed the full power of the piano. Thundering bass lines, cascading scales in both hands, chords that seemed impossible to reach. Isaiah attacked it with fierce determination. His hands moved in a blur. Octave runs ascending and descending the keyboard. The kind of passages that make audiences gasp at the sheer physical difficulty. He wasn't playing perfectly. Some notes blurred together. Some runs were slightly sloppy. But the energy was incredible. raw power channeled through 88 keys. This was rage. All the anger Isaiah had carried for 18 years. Anger at drunk drivers, at war, at God or fate or whatever force had taken his family, at the universe for being so cruel, at himself for surviving when they died. The piano rang out under the force of his playing. The Steinway was built for this, designed to handle the most aggressive playing. But even it seemed shocked by the violence of Isaiah's attack. Julian actually stepped back. He'd never heard someone play with this kind of intensity. It bordered on destructive. But it was also thrilling. This was music as catharsis, as weapon, as scream. The audience sat in stunned silence. Some people looked almost frightened by the power of what they were hearing. This had moved beyond entertainment. This was witnessing someone's psychological breakdown in real time expressed through classical music. But then the anger began to transform. The music started to shift. Softer, more controlled. The rage giving way to something else. Grief. Pure, bottomless grief. Isaiah's playing gentled. The thundering chords became tender. The aggressive runs became flowing melodies. He was moving into the concerto's emotional heart, the section where all pretense falls away and only truth remains. His fingers caressed the keys now, instead of attacking them, each note deliberate, meaningful. This was the sound of a man mourning. Not fresh grief, old grief. The kind that's lived with you so long it's become part of your identity. He saw Emma in his mind, not the baby he'd barely known, but the girl she might have become. 5 years old, 10, 15. All the birthdays he'd missed, all the moments stolen. He saw Sarah at different ages. The young woman he'd met at Juilliard, the wife saying goodbye before deployment, the mother he'd only seen through video screens, the future they'd never have. The music carried it all. Every might have been, every stolen tomorrow. People throughout the audience were openly weeping now. Not just a few, dozens. The music had broken through every defense. Rich and poor, young and old, all of them were feeling it. The unbearable weight of loss. The love that doesn't die just because the loved one does. A veteran in the balcony, a man who'd served in Vietnam and lost half his squad, was crying into his hands. He understood. He knew what Isaiah was playing, what it meant to carry the dead with you forever. Sarah's mother, if she'd been there, would have recognized this. The sound of her son-in-law finally grieving properly. Not drowning it in alcohol or pushing it away, actually feeling it, processing it through the only language he'd ever really spoken fluently. Julian's tears were flowing freely now. He wasn't thinking about ego anymore, wasn't calculating or performing. He was just a human being shattered by beauty and truth. He'd spent his career playing music perfectly, every note in the right place, every dynamic precisely controlled. And in that perfection, he'd missed the point entirely. Music wasn't about perfection. It was about connection, truth, vulnerability. This homeless veteran understood that in a way Julian never had. The piece moved toward its final section, the resolution, where all the themes come together, where Rachmaninoff answers the questions posed in the opening. Isaiah played it with exhausted grace, like a man who's run a marathon and sees the finish line. The notes were gentle now, accepting. This was the sound of someone who'd fought grief and finally maybe found a way to coexist with it. The melody returned, the same one from the opening but transformed. What had been sad and tentative was now bittersweet and beautiful. Proof that something broken can still create beauty, that scars can become art. Isaiah was barely conscious of the audience anymore, barely conscious of the stage or the concert hall, or anything except the music and the memories and the conversation he was having with the dead. Sarah, Emma, I'm still here. I'm still breathing. I'm still carrying you with me, every day, every moment. You're not gone. Not really. Because you live in this music, in these hands, in this heart that refuses to stop beating, even though it's been broken beyond repair. The final crescendo approached. Not angry now, not aggressive, just full, complete. The sound of a life lived and lost, and somehow impossibly continued. Isaiah's hands rose and fell. The chords accumulated. The melody soared. Everything Rachmaninoff had written, every note of this magnificent piece, was building to this moment. And then with a final gentle chord, it ended. Silence. Isaiah's hands lifted from the keys. He sat motionless, eyes still closed, tears streaming down his face. 18 years of silence broken. 18 years of grief finally partially released. The audience sat frozen. 2,000 people in absolute stillness. This is the moment in concerts where applause begins. Usually immediately, but no one moved. No one clapped. Everyone just sat in the weight of what they'd witnessed. 5 seconds of silence. 10 seconds. 15. Isaiah opened his eyes slowly, blinked, remembered where he was, on a stage, in front of people, having just poured his soul out for strangers. The vulnerability hit him like a physical blow. He'd just exposed everything, every wound, every scar, every piece of pain he usually kept hidden. These people had seen him, really seen him, all the broken pieces. He started to stand, to flee, to run from this exposure. And then someone in the balcony stood up. The older veteran who'd been crying. He stood and began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, each clap like a statement. Then someone else stood. A woman in the orchestra section. Then another person. Then 10. Then 50. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, 2,000 people standing. And the applause began. Not polite applause, not the courteous appreciation you give a good performance. This was something else. Thunder, recognition, gratitude for witnessing something true. The sound rolled over Isaiah in waves. He stood there shaking, overwhelmed, not understanding. Why were they applauding? He'd played imperfectly, missed notes, lost tempo in places, but they weren't applauding the technique. They were applauding the courage, the honesty, the proof that beauty can come from brokenness. The applause grew louder. People weren't just clapping now. They were cheering, shouting. The veteran in the balcony saluted. Others followed suit. Isaiah couldn't process it. His mind, already overwhelmed from the performance, couldn't handle this response. He just stood there, tears still falling, while 2,000 people gave him an ovation that shook the walls. Julian Westwood stood beside the piano, clapping harder than anyone. His face was wet with tears. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. His expensive suit jacket was crumpled. He looked at Isaiah and saw everything he'd never been. Real. Vulnerable. True. This man had nothing. No home. No career. No family. But he had something Julian, for all his success and acclaim, had never possessed. soul. The applause continued for a full minute, then 2 minutes. People didn't want to stop, didn't want this moment to end, didn't want to return to normal life where homeless veterans are invisible and music is just entertainment. Finally, Isaiah raised a trembling hand. The gesture said, "Please, stop. I can't take any more." The applause slowly faded. People sat down reluctantly. The silence returned, but different now, charged with emotion and respect. Julian approached Isaiah. Up close, he could see every year of hardship etched into the veteran's face, could smell the reality of homelessness, could see the trembling in hands that had just created such beauty. Julian's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I need to apologize. To you. To everyone." He turned to face the audience, Isaiah standing beside him. "I invited this man on stage as a joke," Julian said, his voice carrying through the hall's perfect acoustics. "I saw someone I judged as less than me, someone I thought I could use to make myself look better. I was cruel, I was arrogant, and I was completely, devastatingly wrong." His voice broke completely. He wiped his eyes. "I've spent my entire life pursuing technical perfection, trying to play music the right way. And in 3 minutes, this man showed me that I've been missing the point entirely. Music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. And I have never in my entire career heard anything as true as what we just witnessed." He turned to Isaiah. "Sir, I don't know your story. I don't know how you learned to play like that. But I know I owe you an apology and my gratitude. You've taught me more in 10 minutes than 20 years of training ever did." Isaiah stood silent, unable to speak. What words could possibly follow what just happened? Julian continued, addressing the audience again. "I came here tonight to perform charity, to give back." What a joke! This man just gave us all a gift beyond measure. The gift of witnessing real artistry, real courage, real humanity. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handed it to Isaiah with shaking hands. "I don't know what you need, but whatever it is, if I can help, please let me. This is my private number, my email. Please use it." Isaiah took the card mechanically, stared at it. The expensive cardstock, the embossed lettering, Julian Westwood concert pianist. "Thank you," Isaiah managed to whisper. The first words he'd spoken since sitting at the piano. Julian nodded, then did something that shocked everyone in the hall. He extended his hand, not for a handshake, but palm up, offering to help Isaiah down from the stage, treating him with the respect due to a fellow artist, an equal. Isaiah took his hand. They walked together down the stage steps. The audience stood again, applause resuming. But Isaiah couldn't stay, couldn't handle any more attention. He released Julian's hand and walked up the aisle toward the exit, desperate for air and solitude and a chance to process what just happened. People reached out as he passed, touched his shoulder, his hand, his arm, offering connection, respect, love from strangers. "Thank you," someone whispered. "That was beautiful," said another. "God bless you," from an elderly woman. Isaiah made it to the lobby, through the doors, out into the November night. The cold air hit his face like a slap. He stood on the sidewalk, gasping, his mind spinning. What had just happened? Had that been real? Had he really just played Rachmaninoff in front of 2,000 people? Had they really responded like that? Inside the hall, the audience was still buzzing. No one wanted to leave. People were talking, crying, hugging strangers. The performance had broken something open, created connections, made people feel. Julian stood alone on the stage, staring at the piano. His entire world view had just collapsed. Every assumption he'd made about talent, artistry, music, life. All of it challenged by 10 minutes with a homeless veteran. He sat down at the piano bench, the same bench Isaiah had just vacated. Put his hands on the keys, tried to play. The notes came out technically perfect as always, and completely, utterly empty. Julian put his face in his hands and wept. 1 year later, Carnegie Hall, New York City, a sold-out concert on a cold December evening. The program listed a special performance by Isaiah Thompson in partnership with the Juilliard Foundation and the Veterans Music Project. Isaiah walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. He wore a simple black suit, tailored but not expensive. His hair was cut. His face showed the signs of proper nutrition and sleep. He looked healthy, alive. But he still carried that same weathered quality, the mark of someone who'd been broken and put back together. Scars don't disappear. They just become part of the story. On the piano, in a small silver frame, was a photograph. Sarah holding baby Emma, both of them smiling. Isaiah sat at the concert grand, looked out at the audience, saw Mrs. Rodriguez in the third row beaming with pride, saw veterans from the program he now worked with, saw Julian Westwood in the front row who'd kept his promise and helped Isaiah every step of the way, saw faces he didn't know, people who'd heard about the homeless veteran who played Rachmaninoff. The story had spread, gone viral. Video of that night in Boston had been watched millions of times. Some people saw it as inspiration porn, feel-good content, but others saw it for what it really was. A story about the redemptive power of art, about human dignity, about the fact that talent and worth aren't determined by circumstances. Isaiah had spent the past year rebuilding his life. Julian had connected him with the Juilliard Foundation, which helped place him in veteran support programs, got him housing, health care for his PTSD. Most importantly, got him back to music. He'd practiced every day for a year, slowly rebuilding technique, working with therapists to process trauma, learning that grief doesn't disappear, but it can coexist with joy. He'd started performing at veteran centers, small concerts for other men and women who'd served and suffered, using music as therapy, as connection, as proof that survival was possible. The Veterans Music Project was born from those performances, a program that brought classical music to veterans dealing with PTSD, homelessness, and trauma. Isaiah was its first official artist and biggest advocate. Now, he was here. Carnegie Hall, the same venue where Julian performed regularly, where the greatest pianists in the world played. Isaiah Thompson, who a year ago was sleeping in doorways, was about to perform for an audience that paid premium prices to hear him play. He began with the piece that had changed everything. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. But this time, it was different. Still emotional, still honest, but not drowning in grief. This was a man who'd processed his pain and come out the other side, not healed. You don't heal from losing your family, but surviving, finding purpose, building something new from the ruins. The performance was beautiful, technically stronger than Boston, emotionally just as powerful, but more controlled. This was mastery, real artistry. The audience listened in rapt silence. When the final notes faded, the ovation was immediate and prolonged. Isaiah stood, bowed, and then spoke to the audience for the first time in his performing career. "A year ago, I was homeless," he said simply. "I'd given up on music, given up on life. Then a kind woman gave me a concert ticket and a second chance. Tonight's performance is dedicated to her husband, Miguel Rodriguez, who loved music and believed it belonged to everyone." He gestured to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was crying openly. The audience applauded her. Every ticket sold for tonight's concert funds. The Veterans Music Project, Isaiah continued. "We bring music to veterans who are struggling, who feel invisible, who need to remember that they still matter, that they're still human, that beauty and purpose are still possible." His voice grew stronger. "I play for every veteran sleeping on a street tonight, for every person whose talent has been buried by trauma, for everyone who thinks their story is over. It's not. As long as you're breathing, as long as you can feel, your story continues. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get a chance to write a new chapter." He paused, looked at the photograph of Sarah and Emma on the piano. "I play for my wife and daughter who I lost 18 years ago. They're gone. That will always hurt. But their love made me who I am, made me a musician, made me a father, made me human, and that love doesn't die just because they did. It lives in this music, in these hands, in every note I play." Tears ran down his face, but he was smiling. "Music saved my life. Not once, but twice. First as a child when it showed me a way out of poverty. Then again as a broken veteran when it reminded me that I was still alive, still capable of creating something beautiful, still worthy of love and respect and second chances." He looked directly at the audience. "If you're struggling tonight, if you feel invisible, if you think your gifts don't matter anymore, I'm here to tell you, you're wrong. Your story isn't over. Your gifts are still there, waiting for you to remember them. And when you're ready, when you find the courage to pick them up again, the world will be waiting to hear what you have to say." The audience erupted in applause. Standing ovation before he'd even played another note. Isaiah sat back down at the piano. He had 3 more pieces to perform tonight. Works by Bach, Chopin, and a new piece composed by Julian Westwood and dedicated to Isaiah. But first, one more Rachmaninoff, a short piece this time, the Prelude in C-sharp minor, 5 minutes of music that sounded like grief and hope and redemption all woven together. He played it beautifully, not perfectly, but honestly, which was always more important. When the concert ended, Isaiah didn't rush off stage. He stood there looking out at the faces, seeing himself in some of them. The struggling, the broken, the survivors. And he hoped that maybe, just maybe, his story would give someone else the courage to keep breathing, keep trying, keep believing that talent never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to rise again.